Thank you so much, Gia. It's always a great pleasure to join you for these events, whether it's in person or on Zoom. And I'm very honored by the invitation, especially at a time like this, where I know that Bashur, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, is going through some trying times, and there's a lot of worries as to where this war will go and what its impacts will be. So, in trying to address your first question about U.S. policy towards the Kurds since February 28th, I want to start by laying out two contextual items here, two parts of the context. The first one is that in January of this year, I don't think that President Trump knew or thought that he would have to go to war against Iran. I think that especially after Israel had delivered a pounding to Iran during the June 12-day war and degraded its air defenses and showed it to be vulnerable and dealt so much damage to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Assad regime had fallen. I think Trump reasoned that Iran would know that it's greatly weakened, and he moved the two U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups to the Gulf and other resources as a kind of way to exert leverage against Iran in the negotiations. And he believed that Iran would read the room and give him a deal in the negotiations that he could then brandish and say, look how much better a deal I got than Obama did in 2015. And specifically, and most importantly, Iran would agree to no longer have nuclear enrichment within Iran, for which Trump was offering them a lifetime supply of free nuclear fuel energy from outside. I think that's how he thought it was going to go down. And clearly that's not how it went down. And he found himself in a situation where he felt the need to launch strikes against Iran. Beyond that, we know that Israel, as well as several of the Gulf Arab states, were privately, well, Israel not so privately, but the Gulf states privately were encouraging Trump to take this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to deal a devastating blow to the Iranians if they did not concede on the important issues in negotiations. So that was the first item of context. And the result is that the preparations for the war were not all in place in February 28th, on February 28th, when the war was launched. Now, the American military has been gaming out the tactics of fighting Iran since like more than 40 years. That's not the issue. They can take orders and carry them out. But the issue was the larger strategy was not set up or thought out and the various options prepared for. If they had been, then he wouldn't need to be having a Marine battalion landing battalion come all the way from Okinawa, Japan, and another one from San Diego to take 2 weeks to reach. He would have had those forces in place because that's one of the options he might need. But so the result is his strategy has been extremely unclear, evolving, badly communicated, because he didn't expect to be going to war at this time. And that has lots of ramifications that we can get into because it causes problems for who will sign up to join the U.S. No ally or no Kurdish force, for that matter, wants to sign up for a campaign where the strategic goals are not clearly stated, where they don't know if Trump's going to end the war a week from now or 2 weeks or only accept regime change. They don't know any of these things. And no one wants to join this effort who lives next to Iran or in Iran for that matter, and then be left holding the bag after the United States calls it a day. So there are very big problems with the fact that he wasn't prepared for war the way one maybe should be on a strategic sense. Yes. Now, the second contextual item is that I'm not sure Trump himself is always fully aware of the differences between Kurdish groups in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. I know that on a superficial sense, he's been told and he knows there's different groups, but I think in his mind, he just washes over the differences and isn't fully cognizant of them. This struck me particularly strongly in 2019 after he got off the phone with Erdogan and withdrew U.S. troops from Syria from the border with Turkey. And then some people told him, oh, there's also oil installations there. You shouldn't totally withdraw. And so then he kept some in and then spoke with the Turks, sent his envoys, and they managed to get a stop to the Turkish invasion that was occurring. He announced that he had solved a Turkish-Kurdish conflict that had been going on for 50 years. And to me, that was like, oh my gosh, U.S. officials may be plenty aware of the differences between Bashur and Bakur and Rojhelat and Rojava and the different political groups there. But Trump himself, in contrast to the Israelis, who also know the differences extremely well, but Trump himself, I think, sometimes gets muddled on these things. So with these two contextual items out of the way, we know that in the first week of the war, Trump apparently called leaders in Bashur to inquire about them supporting his effort against Iran. Specifically, he spoke to leaders of the KDP and the PUK. This was a ridiculous ask for Trump to make. It was under the first Trump administration in 2017 that the U.S. under Rex Tillerson stated that the referendum on independence was illegitimate, not just something that the U.S. was not supporting, but illegitimate. And the U.S. has always demanded that, the Kurds remain part of a unified Iraq and recognized the government in Baghdad as leading the show. So suddenly for Trump to call the Kurds in Erbil and Slemani and ask if they would join this war, which is something that Baghdad very much rejects and is not for, is absurd. Are they independent or are they not? Because the U.S. said they're not. So if they're not, they have to follow Baghdad's lead on foreign policy issues. And that is very much not something that Baghdad favored. So I think he had not understood that when he made that phone call. But apparently he also called at least one leader of a Rojhelati group, Mustafa Hijri, and possibly more, to talk with them about joining the campaign. And shortly after that, we believe he received a phone call from Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, predictably, and telling him not to pursue any strategy relying upon the Kurds, at which point he changed his mind about this Kurdish-centric strategy. The thing is, Turkey has diametrically opposed interests to the U.S. in this conflict. Turkey does not want to see a new regime in Iran that's a Persian nationalist and secular or democratic, allowing the Kurds and other groups democratic autonomy. The ideal for Turkey is to have a very weak Iran in its current form. So Turkey has diametrically opposed goals to the U.S. on this, and to be listening to Turkey's concerns on this is therefore a problem for U.S. leaders. But just like Obama during the war against ISIS and Assad, Trump is left flailing about looking for a strategy that may work, but not involve large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground in Iran. That's his dilemma. Yeah. I think under those circumstances, his only options may be failure or a large number of U.S. troops on the ground, which is not politically attractive in the United States, to put it mildly, or a third way strategy that starts by relying on Rojhelati Kurdish groups. Bashuri Kurdish groups are not available for this, at least not at the beginning, not until it looks clear that it would be successful. But a third way strategy that relies on Rojhelati Kurdish groups, but expands from there. And I'll conclude this part of the question by just saying what that strategy looks like. The idea here is, okay, the different Rojhelati parties, the KDPI, PEJAK, PAK, the two Komalas, and so forth, that came together under a unified political umbrella, they've got between them several thousand Peshmerga, trained and able to fight. That's not a large number compared to the nearly 1 million security forces that the regime has. But the idea here is that with US and Israeli air support, they would go into Iranian Kurdistan and start liberating towns and villages. And anytime the Iranian army masses to counter them, they get obliterated by air power. That's what air power is good at, right? And by creating the first nucleus of a liberated zone in Iran, you give Iranian army units somewhere to defect to, because there are many who are disaffected with the regime. And this, of course, is how the new Syrian army was created in the Syrian civil war. It was Syrian army units of Assad that defected. So you give them an actual physical territory they can defect to, and you show the example to other groups within Iran that the regime change objective is serious, and you start operating out of that area. The other opposition groups, Persians, Azeris, Baluch, Arab, start operating out of there the way the Iraqi National Congress operated out of Iraqi Kurdistan from 1991 to 2003. That would be that strategy. Now, whether or not it can be successful, whether or not the Peshmerga and comrades of the different Rojhelati groups are strong enough to be the tip of the spear to even initiate that first strategy. I'm going to answer that, but not immediately, because I want to stay within 5 minutes, and I kind of address that. Where I left off before was that like Obama had no more options to fight ISIS in Syria and therefore turned to the PYD and the Syrian Kurds against Turkey's wishes, we might have a similar situation arise in Iran, where even though Turkey is saying don't pursue a Kurdish-centric strategy, for lack of other options, the US may feel that it needs to prioritize succeeding in its campaign against the regime in Iran, and therefore work with the Kurds. Now, both the Rojhelati Kurds and the Bashuri Kurds would need guarantees. For the Rojhelati Kurds, they want to make sure that if they're going to take the fighting to hand, take to the field, and lose thousands of lives, because their strategy is they send in their couple of thousand Peshmerga, and then as they liberate areas in Rojhelat, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people rally to them and swell their ranks, right? But it would be a bloody prospect, and they want to make sure that it's not all for nothing, that after it's over, the US doesn't undercut their demands for decentralization, democracy, federalism in Iran, or allow Turkey to invade and attack them and take away their gains the way it happened in Syria. So the US could, for the Rojhelati Kurds, simply say it will support their demands for democratic federalism and decentralization for as long as they don't seek to change Iran's borders, for instance, right? That could be the way to square that circle. But the US would also have to commit to protecting them from Turkey and warn Turkey in no uncertain terms that intervention against them would not be accepted. Now, for the Bashuri Kurds, if they get involved in this, or even if they're seen to be allowing Iranian Kurds based in Iraq to cross into Iran to begin the campaign, they will face even more attacks than they've been facing. And you're quite right to point out that Iraqi Kurdistan has been hit far more than anyone else. But they will face more attacks from Iran on everything, as well as the Hashd al-Shabi militias in Baghdad. They will be put in an extremely difficult position in the short term. To get them to be on board, the US will have to promise them more than it's ever promised before, and it will have to be formalized. That's a choice that I'm sure is being communicated to the US, because right now those assurances aren't there. And we see the news today is that authorities in the Kurdistan regional government have demanded the closure of Iranian Kurdish political groups' offices in Hawler and in Slemani because they're under pressure from Iran. That's what these attacks are, right? And they're under pressure from Baghdad. So it requires the United States to go a step further in its Kurdish policy than it's been willing to go before. The Taiwan example you give is right on the mark, I think. I think this is what would be necessary. And so the question is, does the United States want to win this campaign? We know the Gulf Arab countries are pressuring them to not leave it unfinished. We know Israel very much wants regime change. So if the US is wanting to do this, then it has to fulfill certain criteria. The long-term consequences of this, if the regime changes, by the way, for Bashul, not just for Rojhelat and so forth, could be amazingly positive. Now, one more thing on what the US has to promise the Iranian Kurds. These things will not be popular amongst some supporters of Reza Pahlavi and the Persian community, but they need to wake up and realize that some 50% of Iran is not Persian, and a strong centralized government in the center, like we've had for the entire modern history of Iran, is not the way to get this 50% of the population on board. As Nagel very correctly pointed out, it needs to be a broad-based opposition to the current regime. And so that the way you bring in the Persian groups is by promising not to change the borders of Iran. And I think the Kurdistani opposition groups have been good about that, calling for democratic federalism and so forth. Maybe with the exception of PAK, the Parti Azadi Kurdistan is a bit more independence-minded. But they all need to compromise the way the Iraqi National Congress came together in opposition, perhaps minus the Ahmed Chalabi element, is the way to get all the Iranian opposition groups together. And so to finish on Israel's position, the issue here is Israel wants regime change very much, is all on board for maximum Kurdish independence, but has also been supporting Reza Pahlavi and his people because they're nice to him, and Israelis have fond memories of good relations with Iran during the time of the Shah and so forth. There's a disconnect there because if Israel can't convince Reza Pahlavi to come up with a more inclusive, decentralized group policy towards non-Persians in Iran, he's never going to be in the same tent as them. So that becomes a part of the circle that needs to be squared in terms of bringing all the Iranian opposition groups together. They have to find a way to overcome the distrust that the current regime has helped to sow amongst Kurds, Azeris, monarchist supporters, Persians, Lur, and others.